Greetings and welcome to our third Irish American Heritage Month history video. Today, our feature is the Irish Down Under, the Irish immigrant experience in Australia. Joining us is Associate Dean and Professor Dianne Hall from Victoria University, and of course, our history chair and our leader when it comes to Irish American Heritage Month and all things history, Dan Taylor. Dan?
Thank you, Danny. You know, when we think of the Irish in Australia here in North America, we tend to think mostly about the part about leaving Ireland. I can remember as a child listening to the Clancy brothers singing about Jack Dugan, the wild colonial boy, and I remember being quite interested when we were told by the Clancys that he was indeed a terror to Australia. We also hear in song of old Pat with his shovel on his back, landing on the shores of Botany Bay. And of course, even today, we hear raucous crowds at Irish international sporting events roaring out in unison the words of the Fields of Athenry about a prison ship that lies waiting in the bay to take a young man away from his young wife and child off to Australia for stealing corn during the Great Hunger. As Americans of Irish descent, we might also be familiar with the remarkable story of the ship Catalpa, purchased by the Clan na Gael in America, outfitted with a crew and a rented captain that sailed to Australia, picked up 6 Fenian prisoners off the coast and brought them back to the United States in a remarkable intercontinental jailbreak. In fact, the association of penal colonies and prisons with Australia is quite strong in the tradition of the Irish people. Fremantle Prison, for example, and 10 other penal sites in Australia are today recognized as World Heritage Properties, having been deemed the best surviving examples of large-scale convict transportation. But today we're going to give you a little bit of something else. We're going to hear the story today of the Irish who went to Australia for whatever reason and stayed. And we're going to hear about their descendants and how they consider themselves today, much like we consider ourselves as Irish Americans or Americans of Irish descent. We're going to learn about how those things are today in Australia. And we're very fortunate to have with us, as Danny said, Professor Dianne Hall, who earned her PhD from the University of Melbourne. She's the editor of the Australasian Journal of Irish Studies, and she's a member of the Irish Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand, and one of the conveners of the Melbourne Irish Studies Seminar Series. Most importantly for us, Professor Hall is the author, with Elizbeth Malcom, of A New History of the Irish in Australia, a 2018 publication that is the most current, up-to-date, and a very insightful examination of the history of the Irish people in Australia. And so with that, Professor Hall, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm really looking forward to talking to you and sharing with you some of the history of the Irish in Australia. I want to start, though, by having a look at one woman as a sort of a jumping off point. I want to talk about Ellen Quinn Kelly. She was born Ellen Quinn in Antrim in 1832. She arrived in Melbourne as a child with her family. And this family settled in small farms north of Melbourne. And initially they did quite well. She herself married at the age of 19 to a pardoned convict, John Kelly, who had been transported to Tasmania for property crimes in Tipperary. The young couple built a house on the Quinn family property, and their first 6 children were born there, including their eldest son, Edward, known as Ned. Ellen was supported in her journey through motherhood by her mother, her sisters, and her Irish neighbours. When the young family moved further north, she was again supported through the births of another 6 children by close female relatives. In turn, she used her experience to assist other women as a midwife. In many ways, we can see her as an example of a successful Irish woman migrant to Australia. She raised her children. She was fiercely independent, fiercely supportive of her children, and raised them with a strong sense of their Irishness. We know very little about women like Ellen Kelly, and because they didn't leave very many records. So in some ways, it's fantastic that we know what we do about her. The reason we know so much about her is that eldest son, Edward, Ned, actually became with his brother Dan a notorious outlaw, bushranger, Ned Kelly. You might have heard of him. But I like to also think very much about Ellen as a successful Irish migrant, although we might argue she took a wrong turn with some of her sons. In many ways, she's typical of Irish women migrants in the 19th century, and in some ways she's not. And I'd like to now take you on a bit of a journey, and I want to talk to you about the broad brushstrokes of Irish migration and settlement in Australia through the convict era up to about 1850, 1860, the mass migration era from about 1850 to about 1921, and then I will also look a bit at post-1921 migration to Australia. Okay. So the Irish convicts, as the songs and the stories, Irish convicts are really reasonably well known in Australian history. They mark the beginning of European settlement in Australia, which is much later than in North America. So European settlement in Australia started in the late 18th century. So there's a very different time scale to settlement of Europeans and the Irish in Australia. Settlement in convicts came to Australia because of North America, really. It was because of American independence that meant that the British could no longer send convicts to North America. They had to find somewhere else to send them, and they looked around to what they knew about the great southern land, Australia, from Captain James Cook's journeys not so long before. And in 1788, the first fleet, as they're called, 11 ships with 775 convicts and 645 soldiers, sailors and officials, landed in Botany Bay, near what is now Sydney. It was only in 1791 that the first ship arrived directly from Ireland, which was the Queen from Cork. All in all, there were about 30,000 Irishmen and about 9,000 Irish women who were convicted and transported to Australia. The reasons that the numbers are a wee bit fudgy is because we don't know exactly how many Irish born were transported through the English courts. We know how many came from the Irish courts. So most of them did come directly from Ireland. And when they arrived, they were often seen by the English authorities as a race apart, something that you'll be familiar with the levels of discrimination, and the viewing of the Irish as somehow different was very similar to the Irish settlers in North America. They were seen as wild and ignorant, and were often, I would say, discriminated against even from the beginning of convict settlement. So in total, the Irish constituted about 25 to 30% of all the convicts who were sent, and they went to Botany Bay, which is Sydney. They went to Moreton Bay a little bit later, which is now modern-day Brisbane. They went to Van Diemen's Land, which is modern-day Tasmania, and that's a picture there of the notorious Port Arthur convict settlement in Tasmania. And they also went to Perth and north of Perth, Western Australia, which is where the Catalpa comes in. What do we know about them? Most of them were from rural areas, which is not surprising, as most of the Irish population was rural. Most of them were illiterate in English, and most of them could speak English, but an unknown number were monolingual or bilingual in Irish. The authorities simply didn't record that information. But we know from little scraps of information that there were Irish speakers who came to Australia right from the beginning. About 10% of these convicts were Protestants. The rest of them were Catholics. 70% were first-time offenders. There's quite a lot of speculation and academic sort of theorising about why that might be so. One theory is that the magistrates in Ireland saw transportation as a means of improving the situation for these rural Irish people, that sending them to Australia gave them a better chance, a pathway in life than sending them to jail in Ireland. Most did not return to Ireland. The vast majority settled in the colonies after they had served their sentence or had been pardoned. Most of them settled quite reasonably happily. They didn't engage in political activity or any rebellious activity that they might have known about in Ireland, except for Castle Hill, which is an incident that happened in 1803, so very early on in the convict settlement, where a group of convicts, many of them Irish, though not all, and led by many but not all Irishmen who had been transported after the 1798 rebellion. It was a very short-lived rebellion. They were looking for a way out. Some of them didn't realise that there was no way out. There was no way they could leave Australia. And it was put down quite quickly by the soldiers, many of whom, of course, were also Irish-born. Many of the British Army were Irish. Now, many people ask about political convicts, about those who were convicted and transported after overt rebellion in Ireland. And actually, there were very few of them who were political prisoners or convicted of political offences. We could argue that many of those convicted of economic crimes, such as animal theft, sending threatening letters, and firearm offences, were also part of political small p, perhaps, political agitation in rural Ireland, but that's not what they were convicted of. They were convicted of theft and mostly economic crimes. If we look at those who were overtly political, what I say sent out after organised rebellions against British rule, about 600. So very, very few, maybe 1%. However, they're interesting and we know a lot about them. Michael Dwyer from Wicklow was convicted after the 1798 rebellion and transported to Sydney with his wife and one child. After he was pardoned, he settled in New South Wales as a small farmer and a local magistrate, local sort of police, and had a reasonably successful life. Him and his wife and children who stayed in New South Wales. After his death in the 1830s, he and his wife, when she died, were buried in a local cemetery. But in 1898, the local Irish organisations got together and wanted to make a big memorial as part of the commemorations of the 1798 rebellion, which happened all over the Irish diaspora. And they then decided that they would rebury Michael and his wife, and they built this fabulous memorial in Waverley Cemetery in Sydney. If you ever go to Sydney, do go and visit. And it has become the focal point for Irish nationalist and Republican commemorations ever since. Some of the other political prisoners that you may know the names of, Joseph Holt was also from 1798 rebellion. He served his sentence in Australia and returned to Ireland after he was pardoned. There's some suggestion he regretted it and he actually would have preferred to stay once he got there and settled, would have looked back on his life in New South Wales as being quite idyllic and wanted to go back, but he did resettle in Ireland. Other names you might know, William Smith O'Brien from the 1848 Rising. He was sent to Van Diemen's Land, and as a gentleman prisoner, he was treated very well and had his own quarters. After his sentence, after he was pardoned, he returned to Europe and then returned to Ireland. John Mitchell was also sent to Van Diemen's Land. You will be familiar with that name. He escaped from Van Diemen's Land and went to the United States. Okay. One of those who were sentenced in the last years of transportation of prisoners to Australia was John Boyle O'Reilly, who was sentenced in 1868 and was among 66 prisoners who were sent to Western Australia. Most of those 66 were, when they were pardoned, stayed in Australia. Some went back, but most of them did stay. 6, of course, were rescued on the Catalpa, as we have seen, and escaped. So part of a very famous episode in convict history. When we're thinking about the convict era in Australia, it's also really important to realise that quite a significant portion of the guards, the soldiers who guarded them, were also Irish Catholic men. who were in the British Army. It was quite common for a sort of trajectory of British Army to send regiments to India, serve there first, and then do a tour in Australia before returning home to Ireland. Okay, that's the convict era, very important era. Then we get to free settlement. So the British government and the colonial governments decided that they wanted to settle with Europeans in Australia. And this started really gathered speed from the 1830s. These were mostly what we call assisted passages. That is, the fares were paid for or subsidised under a variety of different schemes from England, Scotland and Ireland. The assistance was needed because it's a long voyage, much, much longer than to North America and much, much more expensive. So it meant that assistance was required for a very, very large number of Irish and English who came. Most of the schemes were actually aimed at the English. They were aimed at English Protestant yeoman farmers. However, the Irish Catholics were very, very good at negotiating around the regulations and taking up this opportunity to come and take up land in Australia. The numbers, though, they need to be looked at in a couple of different ways. Excuse me. By 1870, as you can see here, 1871 census, Australia had received about 214,000 Irish settlers, which doesn't sound very much compared to the 1.9 million Irish who were living in the United States at the time, and even against those in British and Canada. However, if we look at the percentage of the European population, in Australia, it's much higher because the Australian European population was much lower. So in 1871, we know that about 13% of the European population were Irish born, which is much higher than that in the United States, Britain and Canada. So there's arguably a more extensive Irish influence, if you like, on the way that white Australia, European Australia developed. By 1901, which is the year when the separate colonies in Australia federated into what then became called the Commonwealth of Australia, the statistics are even more stark, if you like. By 1901, 25% of the European population was Catholic. And before the Second World War, we can pretty much equate Catholic with Irish, either born or of descent. One of the things that is another difference between Australia and the United States in researching Irish settlement is that our census data is very different. We don't have individual returns. They were not saved at the time, usually. It's complex history, but essentially we don't have them. We've only got aggregate numbers. And in the 19th century, the census aggregators did not record who was Irish-born Catholic and who was Irish-born Protestant. So we've had to do some creative accounting, if you like, with the census findings. What historians generally think is about 20 to 25% of the Irish who arrived in Australia were Protestant and the rest were Catholic. So where did they come from? So this is the assisted passages. So the 19th century, when most people came in assisted passage. There were groups who came always paying their own way, particularly around the gold rushes. So Australia also had major gold rushes in the 1850s, and we do get a big spike in people from the island paying their own way, just as happened in the United States with the gold rushes. And some of them actually went to California and then Melbourne, or the other way around. They went to Melbourne first and then California, chasing the gold, and New Zealand, chasing the gold around the world. Okay, where did the assisted ones come from? Because we've got good records of those. We have a big cluster who came from the counties of Clare, Limerick, Tipperary and Offaly, as you can see there marked out in blue. They were mostly Catholics. But we also have a lesser known cluster of Protestant small farmers who came from Fermanagh, Cavan and Tyrone as well. Apart from that, we know that Irish came from every county in Ireland. And as you saw at the beginning, Ellen Quinn's family came from Antrim, Catholics from Antrim. So absolutely came from every county, but this is where you get clusters who came. Just as in the United States, the Irish came often in chains of migration. So sometimes a convict family would be first, and then they'd bring out their wives and children, and then you'd get cousins and siblings would come, and that would be the start of chains of migration. So who were these assisted migrants? As I said, a large number of those who took up the passage were from Ireland, which is not what the people designing it wanted, but that's what they got. And so we've got about 52% were Irish. Women took this up very enthusiastically. So in some cases, we have up to 70% some years of Irish women who came. Most Irish men and women who came were single and young adults. They were mostly between the ages of about 18 and 24, 25. Although there were some families, like Ellen Quinn's family also came. When you look at the shipping records, you can think that they're coming out on their own, and you can feel a bit sorry for these young adults who are coming out to such a long voyage, 3 to 6 month voyage on their own. When you dive deeper into their families, and if we can, we find that actually they're not so alone. They're coming with cousins or with neighbours, and they're coming to network. Most of them are coming to networks. Somebody is meeting them at the boat. They've got cousins or neighbours or somebody who they can go and stay with until they get themselves on their feet. Not everybody, by no means, but many people. And you can see there in the example we have from 1861, just thinking of that chain migration. 2,500 took up the assistance to come to Victoria, the colony of Victoria in 1861. Irish who were sponsored through the assisted schemes. 61% of those were women. They were sponsored by, so this is the people who were already here, 50% of them was by their siblings, brothers and sisters or cousins, sometimes by their children and occasionally by their spouses. So there's strong chains bringing people to Australia. People often ask about the effect of the famine on migration to Australia. It had obviously a profound effect on migration to North America, a lesser effect to Australia. And this was because of the length and expense of the voyage. The poorest of the poor could not afford to go to Australia. Even under the assistance programs, they still had to come up with what they called their clothing. So they still had to come up with some money to pay for what they needed on the ship. And they often did that through relatives in Ireland or from going to the priest or minister who would find that money to equip them. There is an uptick in people from Ireland taking on these, joining these assisted migration programs, which is probably from the famine, but these are the people who survived the famine. The one program that was just for the famine was to do with a female assisted migration scheme known as the Orphan Scheme, where about 4,000 girls or young women aged between 14 and 19 were selected from workhouses and they were brought out to Australia between 1848 and 1850. And again, that was a scheme funded by the government and charitable institutions. Although it was successful for those women, the majority of them settled and did well. Some didn't, but the majority did. It was abandoned early because people in Australia saw them as dirty, unfit to be servants, not what they wanted, wild, all the stereotypes you can think of. They were thrown at these women. And as I've talked about, chain migration. Okay, so this is just the Famine Orphans, just very quickly. Here's a picture of one of them who did very well, Mary Haythorpe, nee Ryan. She arrived, and then this is a picture of her with some of her children later on. They went to the Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney. So if you're ever in Sydney, do go to Hyde Park Barracks. They have a wonderful display about the Famine Orphans. And they also have a big memorial to the famine, a famine memorial, which is in the grounds of Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney. And that's a picture of it there. It's got glass with the names of all the girls written on the glass. Now, turning to arrivals after 1821. So these are in the 20th century, after Irish independence. We have several groups come. Some come directly after the wars of independence and the civil wars. They're a small number, but they come to escape, to get a better climate, to get better economic opportunities. Less, again, than went to North America, but some did come. One example is May O'Carroll, near Gown. She was a Common Amon member from the beginning, from 1916 until 1923. She married John O'Carroll in 1917, and initially after the end of the Civil War, she and her husband went to England, and then they migrated to New Zealand and then to Australia, to Sydney. They migrated mostly, it seems, because of her need for a fresh start after the trauma of what she'd experienced in the wars. She talks about it as nervous exhaustion. We might talk about it as post-traumatic stress. She had a large family and remained committed to Irish republicanism throughout her life and John's life, including when she, in the 1930s, and there's a picture there at Waverley Cemetery that I showed you just before. In the 1930s, in 1936, she laid the wreath at Easter time to commemorate the rising. She was at Waverley. She was carrying her Common Amon uniform. I think she could no longer fit into it. But anyway, she was carrying her uniform, and she remained committed to republicanism. She did get a pension from the military pensions, and if you look it up, you can read what she wrote in those. This is where we get these details from, which made a profound difference to the family's life. They could afford a small house and send their children for music lessons, and her children ended up being talented musicians. Many others in the 20th century came out to be labourers, many nurses and teachers. And so there is a steady trickle of migrants throughout the 20th century. Since the latter of the 19th century, there has, of course, been a steady stream of Irish religious. It was only in the late 19th century that the first seminary for local priests was established in Manly in Sydney. And you can see that there. One of those who attended that was the Australian-born of Irish parents priest Patrick Hartigan. He became a very beloved priest of a parish in Narrandera, which is in rural New South Wales. And he was also a talented poet. And he wrote many poems under the name John O'Brien. And that's a picture of his Around the Boree Log, celebrating the close bonds that the Irish who settled in rural New South Wales had with their communities and with their church, as you can see from the cover of that book there. Some of them are quite humorous, and some of them are, as of the time, he wrote many of them in the 1920s, quite sentimental to our tastes. But he was an important figure in the transmission of Irish Catholic values, if you like, in Australia. There were also, one of the things that is, and the priests are quite, the way, I sort of put the way the Catholic Church built up infrastructure in Australia is one of the similarities with North America. Vast infrastructure from cradle to grave, hospitals, churches, schools, and institutions for the aged and sick were set up throughout Australia, and very successfully, and Patrick Hartigan would be an example of that. Another similarity is visits from Irish, enthusiastic visits and receptions of Irish politicians with nationalist and Republican causes. There were many over the years. This is just a few. Here's John and Willie Redmond, the Redmond brothers, Home Rule politicians in Melbourne in 1897, with Irish Australian Dr. Nicholas O'Donnell, who was committed to Irish Home Rule. We also have Kathleen Barry, who was the sister of Kevin Barry. She toured with Linda Cairns, instructions of Eamon de Valera for the anti-treaty side. And they toured in 1924, raising money for the dependents of Irish Republican prisoners. And she was very successful. They had a very successful tour. They did have to damp down their military past and present themselves very much as good women, but they did that very successfully. And Eamon de Valera himself came in 1948, and here you can see him again at Waverley Cemetery, and just pointing out how important Waverley Cemetery and that memorial is to Irish Australians. There's also another similarity with North America is the discrimination and prejudice against the Irish, using very, very similar motifs. This is just a couple. You will recognise these anti-Irish stereotypes, and they remain throughout the 19th century and in different ways in the 20th century. And these are certainly, many of them are sort of symbolism that is taken from American newspapers. We also have a growing confidence in politics and economic prosperity among the second and third generations of the Irish in Australia, and a strong connection with the Labor Party. That's the political sort of affiliation of many Irish Catholics. There's too many to go into, but just a couple of examples to whet your appetite if you want to look any of them up. T.J. Byrne was a charismatic and important Premier of the colony of Queensland in the late 19th century. His parents were born in Ireland. He was a very short-lived Premier because, unfortunately, not long after he was elected to widespread acclaim, he died quite young. We also have Bella Gearin, who also had Irish-born parents. She was the first woman to graduate university in Australia, and she was a Labor Party organiser and a supporter for women's votes in Australia. James Scullin was actually had Irish parents, and he was Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia. So once all the states had come together, there's a structure of having a federal government as well, and he was Prime Minister during the Depression. And the Prime Minister during the war also had Irish-born parents. He was also the Labor Party Prime Minister, John Curtin, and he died in office in the final year of the war. But there are some differences between Irish settlement in Australia and Irish settlement in North America. One of the I think quite important one is that the Irish settlement in Australia was quite dispersed. There was not groupings of the Irish like there were in, say, New York. There were Irish in cities, but they were also dispersed throughout Australia, or throughout the settled parts, particularly of the eastern states. You can see here that's a map of Australia, and one of the things to realise is that the areas that sort of support farms, towns, European settlement in general is concentrated around the coasts. The inner area is much harsher, and there are far fewer settlements still today. So you can see there's settlements around Perth, and then the major ones are in the eastern states. Just as an example of where Irish people settled, this is just a little map that shows where the Irish female orphans went. So those 4,000 girls who came out in the 1848, 1850 have been widely studied. And you can see from the towns listed of where they went that they dispersed very, very widely in the farming areas as well as some of the major towns. So that's just an example of the widespread dispersal. One of the other differences that I think is quite important is that Australia developed a tradition of far less overt support for physical force republicanism or Fenianism than the United States did. The main reason for that, the main sort of overarching reason for that, is that Australia remained part of the British Empire. When it was in the 19th century, they were colonies of the British Empire, and after Federation in 1901, still part of the British Empire, and then the Commonwealth. And to this day, the British Crown is the head of state, which meant that during the times when physical force republicanism in the 19th century and early 20th century, and even perhaps into the Troubles, one could argue that expressing or acting upon those views within Australia was seen as treason against the state, against the Australian and then the British state. Therefore, people tended not to do it. There was far more support in the 19th and early 20th century for home rule. As you can see here from they had a ball scheduled in 1914 celebrating home rule, and there were many Irish Australian politicians and activists who had already booked their passage in 1914 to celebrate home rule when they had to stop because of the war. There were certainly some support for republicanism, and some of that happened at different points, but it was much, much smaller. One of the sort of celebrated ones was when a man who said he was a Fenian, Henry James O'Farrell, in 1868 fired a shot, tried to assassinate Prince Alfred, who was the son of Queen Victoria, who was at a St Patrick's Day picnic in Clontarf in Sydney. He missed. I think he got a small bullet graze. And O'Farrell was very, very quickly captured, interviewed, and tried within a week and was executed very soon afterwards. The politicians who were involved in this case said that they knew plots, that there were Fenian plots everywhere, and it did lead to a big Fenian scare in which anybody who refused to stand for the to say cheers to the Queen could be taken off to jail. They weren't jailed for very long. It was a misdemeanor, but there was a feeling of tamping down on Fenianism. That also happened in 1917 as well, during the war, when there was a group who were training in the mountains outside Sydney to, well, whether they were serious or not, but they said they were going to go and help with the War of Independence. They were also captured and were put in prison. And they successfully argued their way out of it to say that they weren't terribly serious and, you know, it was all a bit of boys' games. But there's some suggestion now that actually they were quite serious and they were in contact with the IRB, and that is what they really wanted to do. But they quite cannily played down their roles. Okay, how am I going for time? Not too bad. I just want to finish off by talking a little bit more about modern Australian migration, so perhaps the last 30, 40 years. From the 1850s to the 1890s, I'd say most of the Irish migrants who came were coming for jobs. There are not many jobs in Ireland. We have nurses and labourers and construction workers who came in the 1950s and up to 1990s. And since the 2000s, we've also had quite a large number of very experienced health professionals coming and working in hospitals. It's very, very common here for nurses and doctors to have Irish accents, and many other educated professionals coming. That's partly also on the back of a large number of what we call backpackers, young people coming for a gap year, travelling around, having fun, doing a bit of work in Australia. I just want to also close with an example of one of those nurses who came. She actually came in the 1940s, Sister Angela Mary Doyle. She's a Mercy sister. She was born in 1925 in County Clare, and she joined the Mercy Nuns, came out to Brisbane in 1940s, worked as a nurse. Worked as a nurse for quite some time in the Catholic hospital there, the Mater Hospital. And then she eventually, from about 1966, she showed great skill as an entrepreneur and an administrator. And she was appointed administrator of the three Mater Catholic public hospitals in Brisbane, a position she held for 21 years. And this period covered transformation in public health care. She also was extremely politically astute, and during the early 1980s, at the beginning of the AIDS crisis that was starting to envelop different places in the world, including in Brisbane, She was working the political structures at the time, was a conservative government who said that no government money would ever support anybody with AIDS. She managed to negotiate with the federal government. This is where the different levels of government sort of came to her favour, to send money to the Mercy Sisters, and the Mercy Sisters then channeled the money to hospices and organisations that assisted those who were living with AIDS. I was a nurse in those hospitals at those times, at those Catholic hospitals, and I remember the stern calmness of Sister Angela Mary in her days as running those hospitals, and certainly pay tribute to her as a very, very strong, one of the very strong Irish women who contributed hugely to the development of healthcare within modern Australia. And with that, I might stop, and perhaps we have time for some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hall. That was very insightful, fascinating. I did want to ask you a few questions. You have a chapter in your book, chapter 6, you talk about employment, and the subheading of that chapter is Bridget Need Not Apply. And you mentioned that there developed the stereotype of an ignorant young Irish woman who would be called Bridget, and the older version would be considered an Irish widow called Mrs. Murphy. Can you talk a little more about, you mentioned how many women came on the ships over to Australia. If they came into an environment where there was this type of prejudice and people not wanting to hire them, how would that young woman from Ireland get by, and what was the experience that they had when they arrived under those conditions?
Thanks for that. Yes, there were majority of the, as I said, up to sometimes the majority of the Irish who came in different periods of the 19th century were young women, and they were wanted because they could be domestic servants by authorities. But when they got here, they often did face prejudice. And when I did some analysis of the ads, the advertisements in the paper, there was a small but significant strain of ads that said essentially no Irish need apply. Or if they didn't say that, they said Protestant only, or words English only, or words to those effects. So if you were a young Irish woman reading those ads in the 1850s, 1860s in a town like Melbourne or Sydney, you would see them, those sorts of ads, every few days. However, and so they did face prejudice, and there were stereotypes of stupid Irish servants who didn't know what to do in a modern Australian house. Absolutely. And there were complaints written in the newspapers about, for the modern housewife, how do you manage your servants when you have somebody like a Bridget who doesn't know what to do? So yes, that was definitely there. On the other side, many of these Australian housewives didn't have much choice, in that the majority, like when they were looking for servants, they couldn't find their English parlourmaid who they wanted to give, a nice middle class veneer to their household, because the bright English parlourmaid didn't migrate. She had quite good job prospects in England. So often, even though they might have wanted to have English parlourmaids, they often had to have Irish servants. And although there was prejudice, these women did get by as well, and many of them married within a few years and set up their own households, and employed servants themselves usually, and many of them were young Irish girls as well that we just don't know very much about.
And you've sort of painted the picture for us. I think you said at the turn of the last century, maybe 25% Catholic and presumably of Irish origin. In Australia, which, as you say, is still within the Commonwealth, what was the effect that you can see today in the Australian national character of this influx of Irish and Irish Catholic people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that that historians have been thinking about for quite some time. The late Patrick O'Farrell, who was a wonderful historian of the Irish in Australia and wrote a book called The Irish in Australia, he argued very strongly that Irish Catholic strain, if you like, of the Australian population led to had a profound effect, partly in a irreverence to authority, in a not taking authority terribly seriously, and in a eventually in a tolerance of difference. I'm not sure I completely agree with the tolerance, but certainly an irreverence that may be attributed to an Irish sort of sense of humour, or an Irish sense of not taking the English authority particularly seriously and finding ways to subvert it. I would certainly say that you could see that in the Australian character as it has developed over the 20th century.
Now, you mentioned the great distance, the length of the voyage. Do you draw anything from the length of the voyage with whether the connections back home to Ireland were any stronger or less strong because of that distance?
That's really interesting. And certainly we do have letters. So there were letters and newspapers went backwards and forwards. There were less for the Irish Catholics than there are for the English Protestants. I think you find that in the United States as well. Certainly the length of time for correspondence to go back and forward was a huge issue for individuals in Australia. And you do get fairly plaintive things in letters saying, have you heard from Johnny? We haven't heard from him in years and years. And the great distances within Australia as well meant that people those bonds did break for many people. One of the things that scholars have traditionally really thought was that once Irish people settled in Australia, they didn't go back. And they didn't go back in the numbers that they went back from North America, for example, with a much shorter journey. I've been doing some research recently which has suggested that, yes, certainly they didn't go back in the same numbers as from North America, but that a surprising number did. And they did find the money for the journey. And that included some who didn't have great resources. They were working class people, but they did return. And for the working class people, particularly, there's a significant sort of stream of widows and children who go back after the breadwinner has died in Australia, and they go back to their homes. And I've done that research looking at the Irish census data from 1901 and 1911. They're not big numbers, but there's a wider variety of people who went back than we had previously assumed. So there is actual traffic, even before the age of aeroplanes, backwards and forwards. There are letters backwards and forwards. And certainly Irish Australians who read their newspapers did know what was happening in Ireland. They did keep up with news. There was a steady stream of information about Irish politics, and there was a steady stream of reviews of Irish books and reviews of talking about Irish history. And the churches and the schools did also keep up that connection with Irish history and culture.
And today in Australia, these descendants of Irish immigrants, what is their sense of Irishness or their sense of connection? Can you talk about Irish Australian organizations and what that looks like today in Australia?
Sure. I mean, there are Irish organisations in Australia. There's the Celtic Club in Melbourne, is one of the longest surviving Irish organisations that still survives. Other Irish organisations have dwindled in other states over the years, and there has been a dwindling, I would say, in connection with associations. However, the influx within the last 10, 20 years of more Irish migrants has kept GAA associations alive, and there are now more Irish business associations that are partly being kept alive by relatively recent Irish migrants. I must say too that any talks that we put on or things like that, there is always an enthusiastic number of people who are interested in their Irish background, even if their own family background goes back, like mine does, to the 1860s. People do keep that up, but I would say it is a minority. Yeah.
All right, and I'm going to turn things back to our national president, Danny O'Connell. I think we might have a question from one of our members.
Thank you, Professor Hall. And we're obviously very interested in Irish immigration today. And as you know, in 1967, the Irish American immigration kind of came to a halt because changes in our immigration policy. And I think, it increased from that point to today, the Irish immigration to Australia and obviously Canada as well. But we could talk all day about that. And I wanted to bring on our Freedom for Ireland chair. We do quite a bit still in Ireland as an organization. I'm glad Dan mentioned the organizations there. Just last year, or just last month, we made approximately $143,000 of donation to groups in the North Ireland, and last year 160,000, to the largest donations we've ever been able to make. And actually, I think the last 4 years were the largest four. So it shows that COVID didn't slow us down. And our leader there is Martin Galvin out of New York. And Martin's been involved so long in Ireland, probably longer than he's been alive, it sounds like, to get everything he's accomplished. But he has a question. And if anyone else on the Zoom has a question, please raise your hand electronically and we'll get you in as well. But Martin, go ahead.
Danny, just the fact that it was 4 years when he was national president, we've been doing so well on donations, and they shifted the credit to me, but you know where it always starts at the top. Professor Hall, thank you. Being in New York, you mentioned the Catalpa Rescue. It's Easter coming up. John Devoy is central to that. John Devoy, how is it possible in the circumstances that existed at that time in the 1860s, for him to get a letter saying, we're here in a living tomb in Australia, and for him to organize a rescue, to coordinate it, to let the prisoners know that they're there, to get the timing right so that they could pull out of that living tomb, as they described it, brought back all the way from Australia, brought back to New York, as give it a hero's welcome here. How is it possible for anybody to organize a rescue like that? It's just unbelievable to me in the circumstances at that time.
Absolutely, it does seem incredible without our quick modern communication that something like that could be pulled off. I think that one of the key things there is that the Irish population in Australia. So to be able to get letters in and out would need support from the people around those prisoners. Most of those prisoners who had gone out to Perth by that stage had been released by the time the Catalpa happened. So they were the last, or some of the last lot who were there. So there were people there who knew them, who knew of the circumstances, who knew all those sorts of things, and they're the ones who would be the go-betweens to get information in and out. They were in prison. But it was a prison that was, by that stage, it was a prison that was more comfortable than some of the prisons that the convict prisoners that we think about, who are chained up on the chain gangs with the lash and things like that. By the 1860s, they weren't living like that. So they did have some communication, and it was the people around them who were able to do that organisation.
Can I ask one other quick question? Just during the period of 1916, around the time of the Black and Tan War, I know there was an Archbishop Mannix from that area who had an exclusion order. I have sympathy for people who got exclusion orders for some reason. What did he do, Archbishop Mannix, to earn that exclusion order from the British government, so he shouldn't be allowed back in any part of Ireland?
Yes, well, Archbishop Mannix was definitely a thorn in the side of the British authorities. He became Archbishop in 1917 in Melbourne. He had been coadjutor bishop before that for a little while. He had a real change of heart as far as Irish politics go once he got to Melbourne. It's quite interesting. He was a fairly standard priest who worked at Maynooth before that, and showed no sign of being a troublemaker. And when he was sent out, when he came out to Melbourne, one of my colleagues actually has a theory, and it's no more than a theory, that when he first came out, he was actually parish priest for an inner city parish where there was a lot of Irish people, families living, who had men at the front. and men who were serving in the Australian Army. And my colleague suggests that it was the experience of going around meeting those families and having to deliver the telegrams saying that their sons and brothers had died that started to radicalise him against the war, against the Australian participation in the war. And from there, he started to become more questioning of Ireland's role in the war as well. So it was from a position in the war that he became quite against both Australian participation and Irish participation in the war. And he gave lots and lots and lots of speeches, very fiery speeches, telling people basically not to enlist, and argued very, very strongly against conscription, because the government at the time tried to bring conscription into Australia twice, and Australia was one of the very few places of the Allies that did not end up with conscription. And that was partly because of Manox's brilliant speeches in mobilising the working class people, but also the Irish Catholics, to vote against conscription. And so for those reasons, the government really didn't like him, and the British government really didn't like him. So it was his support. He was the only archbishop, member of the church hierarchy, who did support the Irish Republicans, and those fighting in the War of Independence. And he, because of that, both the Australian authorities and the British authorities thought that he was too much of a firebrand. He was too much of a good speaker, and he would draw people to him. Therefore, they thought it was dangerous that he would go to Ireland, even though he kept saying he wanted to go to visit his aging mother, and I'm sure he did. But it was at a sensitive time, and that was why he was excluded. Instead, he went to England and gave lots of fiery speeches there.
So Martin was also the recipient of an exclusion order for the North Ireland, and he just simply went to the North Ireland and still gave his speeches. So he's
I wouldn't say I was a firebrand, but
yeah, great work over
well,
the years.
I think that Archbishop Manox used that exclusion as a way of getting attention, a way of getting, people to pay attention to what the message out. Absolutely. So except for visiting his mother, and I'm sure he wanted to visit her. I think he was not necessarily displeased with the amount of attention that it drew. Yeah.
And if he's anything like Martin, he may have gone in and visited his mother, and there's just no record of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
I couldn't comment.
That was brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant. What an incredible presentation. Great work on the slides and everything. Dan, any closing comments before we close here?
Sure. I want to thank Professor Hall again. I want to let our viewers know that the book is A New History of the Irish in Australia. It's available on Amazon. So if you enjoyed our content today, by all means, get the book and read it for yourself. Thank you very much, Professor Hall, and thanks to all of our team today.
And there's a link
Thanks
to the
very
book.
much.
There's a link to the book on our emails, and we'll be sending it out again at the end of the week. All of our webinars from our Irish American Heritage Month. Great job, Dan Taylor, and your team putting this all together. Professor Hall, any closing comments before Chris Cook gives us a song? And Chris is a tremendous musician in his own right. He's also our backbone for these presentations as our chair. And we appreciate all your help, Chris. But any closing words, Professor, before we go to our closing music?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. I very much enjoyed speaking with you all.
Now, the professor is going to go to Notre Dame in the near future. The AOH, as everyone on this call knows, the AOH has a tremendous relationship with the University of Notre Dame and the Cushwa Center, and the Notre Dame has some archives and so forth. And I'm sure you're going to have a splendid trip there. It is walking on to campus of Notre Dame, and I've had a background in athletics, so I've been on a tremendous number of campuses. There's nothing like going to Notre Dame. So safe travels with that.
Thank you.
Chris,
thank you.
Chris Cook, the floor is yours for our closing music here, related right back to Australia. Go ahead, Chris.
one day. I'm up to a new land, my fortune to try, and I'm ready to sail away. Far away in Australia, soon will fate be kind, and I will be ready to welcome the lass, the girl I left behind. Must we be parted? His fair one cried, I cannot let you go. Still I must leave you, the young man replied, but for only a while, you know. Far away in Australia, soon will fate be kind, and I will be ready to welcome the lass, the girl I left behind. Whether in success or failure, I will always be true. Proudly each day in the land far away, I'll be building a home for you. Far away in Australia, soon will fate be kind, and I will be ready to welcome the lass, the girl I left behind. Daily she waits at the old cottage gate, watching the whole day through, till a sweet message comes over the waves, in the new world are joined the two. Far away in Australia, soon will fate be kind, and I will be ready to welcome the lass, the girl I left behind.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.